We're beginning to look at the New Testament, but the way we're starting actually is by taking some time to think about what happened in the years between the Testaments. So the Old Testament ended about 400 years before the New Testament began. And the reason we're taking some time to think about all this history is not just because we love history so much, ancient history, but instead because we understand that what happened during these years provides much of the setting for what we're going to read about in the Gospels. It's hard to understand the Gospels and really the rest of the New Testament without understanding at least a little of what happened in the intertestamental period. Like, for example, in the Gospels we read that Rome was in charge, and Rome obviously wasn't in charge of Israel at the end of the Old Testament, but they were at the beginning of the New, and they took over Israel around 63 BC because Israel was just an absolute mess. And when they came to Israel, they saw that and they didn't like what was going on. And so what Rome did was take the high priest who had been serving as basically the political leader of Jerusalem and replace him and actually changed the whole system entirely. You remember the high priest had become basically a political leader, a servant, almost like a little king, serving on behalf of the empire that had been in charge. But Rome changed that setup, and so no longer was the high priest the one who was the chief political leader of Jerusalem. Instead, his primary job was now to take care of the temple. He still had a role. He was made the leader of something we call the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin had been around for a while, but it was a group of 70 men that made certain decisions. But basically, at this point, Rome gave political power to other leaders instead. One of the leaders' names was Antipater, and they made him a procurator of Judea, and he was killed around 43 BC. He had two sons, though. One of those sons' names was Herod, and Herod was given power in Galilee. Herod wasn't Jewish, he was an Edomite, but he was a very good politician. Both he and his father actually had a way of ingratiating themselves with the leaders of the moment. His brother was given control over Judea. Around this same time, though, one of the sons of one of the brothers who had been defeated by Rome still wanted power. And so he made an alliance with another empire of the time, the Parthians, and he fought the one Rome had put in charge of Jerusalem and imprisoned him, where he ended up committing suicide. And then he actually bit off the ears of the high priest so that he could become complete, total ruler of Jerusalem, and he did that for 3 years. In the meantime, Herod had gone to Rome, and they gave him power of Judea in 40 BC, but it took him a while to win Judea back. It took him about 3 years, actually, and he became what we might call a client king. So he was a king, but he was a king under the Romans, and the way he retained power in this region was by making himself useful to the Romans. And he was brutal. He was known for his cunning and his savage nature. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, writes, he was a man who was cruel to all alike, and one who easily gave in to anger and was contemptuous of justice. He even murdered people in his own family. There was a Roman emperor who said, I would rather be one of Herod's pigs than Herod's son. But he was also a great builder. If he hadn't done anything else, we would remember Herod for being such a great builder. And one of his great projects actually was expanding the temple. One scholar explains, the reconstruction of the National Shrine was his greatest building enterprise. The project began early in 19 BC. 1,000 Levites were trained as builders. The first stage of its reconstruction took 10 years to complete, and the finishing touches were not put on until AD 63. So this is like an 80-year building project. And he worked on it until it became one of the wonders of the ancient world. But he did that through oppressive taxation, which of course made the people angry. And it's part of why in 4 BC, when he was about to die, as he was getting ready to die, nobody was very sad. And yet Herod, of course, being the egotistical dictator that he was, wanted people to mourn. And so he thought, a good way to get people to mourn, he arrested a lot of people and he had them imprisoned, and he gave instructions to kill them when he died, because he thought, of course, people will cry for them, but at least there will be mourning when I die. But of course, they didn't do that. But that gives you a picture of his nature and helps you appreciate how at the beginning of the Gospels, it's not very surprising to find out that Herod, when he heard about Jesus, responded by having all the children in Bethlehem killed. That was his nature. That is how he acted. After he died, he had one son who was given rule of Judea, and he ruled there from 4 BC to 6 AD. He was not a very good ruler. He was also very cruel. His 9 years of rule proved so oppressive, actually, that in AD 6, Augustus deposed him and sent him into exile for fear that if he were left much longer in command of Judea, there would be a large-scale revolt in the land. Rome basically wanted two things: their money and peace. They just didn't want problems. And so Archelaus had all of his father's defects of character with little of his father's actual diplomatic and administrative ability. And so after Archelaus, Rome just put governors in charge of Judea. And this is when Roman soldiers and Roman presence really increased in Jerusalem. But Herod had two other sons, and one of them was put in charge of Galilee. His name was Antipas, and he was a good ruler. And then there was another son named Philip, who was given charge of another region. And then the grandson of Herod, Herod Agrippa, ruled as king from AD 37 to AD 44. And then he had a son, Herod Agrippa II, who was given rule over a region in the north from 50 to 70 AD, which also marks the next great crises in this particular time in Israel's history. Remember, we've looked at 5 nations that were in control of Israel during the intertestamental period, and we talked about 5 great crises as well. And this is the 5th great crisis, because right around 66 AD, the Jews revolted against Roman authority. And they didn't like Rome, and yet Rome had actually done some good things. As someone had written, Rome combined military might and strength with justice and public order. Its system of roads, many of which have lasted until today, gave to the empire a transport system never known before. The contribution of Rome to God's purpose was that at Christ's coming, the world was strongly governed, law-protected religions. The Roman network of roads protected people from thieves, and it meant that the gospel, could go from Spain to Russia, from Babylon to Scotland quickly. But still, with all the good maybe that Rome did, the Jews did not like being ruled by Rome at all, and so they revolted. And the main center of that revolt, just like Jesus prophesied, was the city of Jerusalem. And there was a great battle. One historian explains the struggle between Romans and the Jews began in Judea and Galilee in AD 66. 7 Roman governors had followed each other in rapid succession, each more cruel than the last. They drove the people to despair and madness by their violations of their religious feelings, and yet perhaps those governors were not altogether to blame. They were at their wits' end. They had been able to handle all sorts of people in every part of the world, but these Jews were beyond them. They were the only people on earth who as a nation would rather die than offer sacrifices to the image of their emperor. They were willing to give up everything, their wealth, their homes, their land, their lives, but they would not give up their God. To the Roman officials, they seemed a spoiled, obstinate, half-demented people, and failing to win them over with kind words, they tried with swords. Thousands of Jews were put to death in those years. They were burned and crucified and massacred in droves. Finally, in the year 66, matters reached a climax. The Jews couldn't stand the tyranny any longer, and they openly rebelled. Roman legions were sent down to Syria to quell the uprising, but to no avail. The Jews fought like lions, and they could not be subdued. Nero, The Roman emperor, realizing this wasn't a little outbreak, quickly sent two of his best generals to the scene. Down through Galilee they marched, fighting wildly a whole year before they brought the region to subjection. Then west of Jerusalem they plowed a bloody furrow, then south, and then at last up to the walls of the city itself. It's chiefly from the writings of a Jewish general named Josephus, a man who deserted his forces and then tried to do penance by recounting the heroism of those who stayed true, that we know what happened during the siege. Jerusalem became the scene of one of the most devastating contests in all of history. And I'm quoting here, but this is an important quote because Jesus prophesied all this. The besieged within the city were divided into three camps, each wrangling with the others over who should be the leader and how the war should be carried on. One held the lower city, another the upper, and a third the temple area in between. Two of the factions began to quarrel over the possession of the town granaries, and after repeated raids and massacres, someone set fire to the whole store so that it was completely destroyed. There they were, 1 million or more Jews, butchering each other in an ancient, dirty, high-walled city, hardly a mile square in size. The food supplies gone, the dread Romans already at the gates, and they would not surrender. They would not surrender. One of the generals had been called back to Rome to be a crowned emperor, and his son began the siege on Jerusalem. His artillery hurled great boulders a quarter of a mile into the heart of the city. Great mounds were built close against the north wall. Huge battering rams were placed on them. Every tree within 10 miles of the city had been cut down to make those rams. And then day and night, the thunder of those battering rams was to be heard. 15 days the incessant pounding went on. And at last a breach was made in the outer wall. 9 days more, and the second wall fell. At last the Romans were masters over the lower city. But still the Jews would not surrender. In the upper city they huddled, starving and dying. There was murder over scraps of meat and bread. At night, those who stole out to pick herbs and roots in the fields were crucified by Romans who captured them. 500 were crucified in one day, or they were slain, or they were robbed when they returned home. Yet they would not surrender. They undermined the Romans' mounds so that the huge battering rams suddenly came crashing to the ground. Then out they stormed like ravenous demons, flinging themselves full tilt at the enemy, clawing, slashing, and biting their way through. The great legions wavered, tottered, broke, and Titus retreated. But then came an even greater horror for the besieged. Titus had a high wall of earth 5 miles in length thrown all around the city and sat down to wait. The suffering of the Jews seemed beyond bearing. Even Titus, a Roman not unused to war, could not stand the sight of it. He begged the mad zealots to surrender and have done with it, but no surrender, never. A month passed. 2. The Romans returned to the attack. One wall fell, but a second had been raised by the Jews in the meantime. The second fell, but still the heroes fought on. They were taking their stand in the inner fortress now. The narrow streets ran with blood. Sickening was the stench of the dead bodies rotting in the hot summer sun. Jews fought each other in the streets over handfuls of the most loathsome food, filthy straw, bits of old leather. The wife of the high priest, who had been wont to have thick carpets laid from her house to the temple so that her sandals might not be soiled, now staggered about in the alleyways in search of crusts. The daily offerings on the altars were no longer made because of the lack of animals, but still there was no surrender. Titus again offered to make terms, but again the zealots refused. They knew what terms with the enemy would mean, giving over their city, and they believed the city was God's, not theirs to give. And so wondrous was their faith that the sight of it compelled some of the Roman soldiers even to desert their own legions and throw in with the besieged. The fortress walls eventually were scaled. The zealots were forced to retreat to the temple courts. For 6 days, the battering rams savagely pounded the sacred walls, and then at last the inevitable end drew near. Titus ordered that the sanctuary be spared, but his infuriated soldiers refused to listen. A burning torch was hurled through the golden window, and immediately the wooden beams caught fire. Into the temple courts the soldiers dashed, massacring the thousands who had taken refuge there. And again there was quiet for a moment. But again, the resistance blazed forth. The zealots retreated to the upper city, to their last inch of ground, and once more defied the enemy. Almost a whole month they held out there before the city crumbled for good. They were starved and exhausted. Their strength was utterly spent. The Romans came raging in, slaying until their arms were tired. Every alley and room and corner was choked with bleeding corpses. Then fire was set to everything, houses, buildings, walls, and the conquerors stood back to watch the flames. And thus was old Jerusalem destroyed. It said that more than 1 million Jews died in that siege. Of those who survived, 97,000 were made slaves. They were deported to labor in the mines of Egypt or were forced to fight wild beasts in Roman arenas. Titus himself carried away the noblest of the zealots to march in his triumphal procession through the broad streets of Rome. A great arch was built there to commemorate his ghastly triumph, an arch on which were carved figures of his young captives carrying the sacred vessels of the temple. That arch is still standing in Old Rome, and the ruins of the blood-soaked walls still stand in Old Jerusalem. Only there are no Romans now to look on that arch and rejoice in the triumph it commemorates. The Jews alone are left, and they come to pray at their old wall even to this day. The Romans have gone the way of the Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and Persians and Greeks. Only the Jews still live. And of course, that's one author's explanation of what happened to Jerusalem. And I read it because it's just so dramatic and so compelling. But of course, we also have Jesus' explanation of why what happened to Jerusalem happened. And it was part of his judgment on Jerusalem for rejecting the Messiah God had sent. And yet we also know why the Jews survived, ultimately survived. It's because the Old Testament tells us God's not done with his plan yet. And that is a basic overview of the intertestamental period. In terms of major events, there were 5 major shifts in power. There were 5 major crises. And I'm sure we could take some time to look at all the different crises a little more carefully and their impact on the Jewish people. But in the next video, I want us just to look at one, and I want us to consider the impact of the rise of Hellenism on the New Testament.